My goal today is to make sure that you never lose to the fried liver attack ever again. That's my goal. For those of you who are new, my name is Coach Dennis. I am a USCFNM. I'm also a chess journalist and professional coach, and I've worked with hundreds of students over the years to improve their chess. And one thing I've noticed very often is that those at the club and scholastic levels struggle with the fried liver attack, which is the opening beginning with the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, so it starts out in the Italian game. And then after knight f6, the first sign that white is up to no good is this move knight g5, which creates a double attack against the pawn on f7. And then black plays d5 to block out white's bishop on c4, and that much is correct, but after pawn takes d5 and knight takes d5, white unleashes the fried liver with the move knight takes f7. Now, unfortunately, this knight is forking both the queen on d8 and the rook on h8, so black really does have to take it. King takes f7. And then after the move queen f3 check, white is again making a fork. White is forking the king on f7 and the knight on d5. Many games continue with king e8 here, and it's almost as if black forgets that when they move the king, they can never castle again. And after bishop takes d5, white gets their piece back. White actually won a pawn in the process. White is threatening queen f7 checkmate, and white is also threatening to win more material by taking on c6. So I would evaluate this position as being already lost for black, not just worse, but lost. A better try for black would be king to e6, because this at least attempts to defend this knight in the center so that black will remain up a piece for the foreseeable future. But this knight is in a terrible pin, and this king is very weak in the middle of the board. So white will add pressure by playing knight c3. And after the main theoretical line, knight b4, castles kingside, c6, and d4, white is ripping open the center to take advantage of black's exposed king. Let's suppose that black tries to trade queens by playing queen f6 here. White should decline that with either queen e2 or queen d1. Now, I don't want to pretend like this position is dead lost for black. I don't think that's true. There have been some efforts by correspondence players to play these lines and to see if they can hold with black in this position, but those players have engines and the database that they can use to help them during their games. And if you're playing this in a tournament, you don't have those tools. And the reality is that I think a human playing black here is going to have a serious uphill battle. The king's going to be weak for a long time, and you're not going to be able to simplify the position for many moves. So white has this sort of permanent initiative, and I don't think that black's going to be able to make use of the extra piece. If for some reason you were not convinced by that line, let me show you another one. After pawn takes d5 and knight takes d5, white does not have to play the fried liver with knight takes f7. There is also the Lolli attack with the move d4, and some strong players have argued that this might be even stronger than the fried liver itself. Now, ostensibly the purpose is to defend this knight on g5, because it was attacked when black played knight takes d5. But white still has the idea to play knight takes f7 in many positions, and white is opening the center as quickly as possible. Let me show you an example. Let's say black plays pawn takes d4. White just castles. And let's say that black rushes to get castled as well, bishop e7. Now white can play kind of an improved version of the fried liver attack by playing knight takes f7. And once again, king takes, there will be queen f3, and it's pretty devastating for black. Going back a little bit, let's suppose that instead of pawn takes d4, black played knight takes d4. Well, in this case, white can play c3. And you can see that these knights are kind of lined up in the center. White's making a sort of skewer. And at this point, the best that black can do is to enter into some obscure complications with the move b5, and black has not done very well from this position. So I would say the Lolli is just as dangerous as the fried liver. So whether it is the fried liver attack that you're afraid of or the Lolli, I would not recommend for you as black to play into this position. I think it's too dangerous. I think that white really does get a big initiative, and of course they have two ways to do it. So what should black do instead? That's what this video is going to be about. I'm going to give you pretty much a foolproof plan for black to foil the fried liver, or at least how to play against fried liver players. And I'm going to do it in 3 stages, 3 levels, you could say. And I know that at least one of them will be right for you, as I like to say. There are two things that I want to make note of before I begin. The first one is that in both the description and the pinned comment down below, there will be a link to a Lichess study, as there so often is when I do opening projects. And the study is going to have all the analysis that I'm going to share with you today, just in sort of a different format. You'll be able to play through the moves on an analysis board. You can even save the PGNs if you want to drill the positions later. And you don't even need to be logged in. You don't need to have an account. You don't need to pay anything. It's completely free. So if you want to view these lines for yourself or just save them, take a look at the study. And the other thing is that my coaching profile is also linked below if anyone's interested in having me help you improve your chess. Okay, let's get into it. So the first stage for how we can deal with the fried liver is very simple, and I'm not going to spend too much time, at least not at the beginning, but you can avoid it completely because after 1e4, first of all, you don't even have to play e5. You could play the Sicilian with c5. You could play the French defense with e6 or the Caro-Kann with c6, and none of these openings allow the fried liver whatsoever. Just to give you an example, let's say that white tries to play in a fried liver fashion against the Sicilian. You'll notice that as soon as this bishop comes to c4, black can play e6, and this bishop will never see f7. And very soon, black is going to push d5 to create a large center and take advantage of this bishop. So I would describe this as not being a very good opening for white. I think that black is already equalizing here. If you want to stick with e4, e5, then you can play the Petrov. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and this avoids the fried liver because if white goes for bishop c4 here, black can play knight takes e4. And this is already known to be a pretty good position for black because if white doesn't do anything, black will push d5, again, achieving a lot of space in the center. Now, this is not to say that any of these lines are just easy solutions to chess. I mean, they avoid the fried liver, but they allow lots of other stuff. For example, if you're playing the Sicilian defense, you need to be aware of c3, d4. You need to be aware of the open Sicilian with knight f3 and d4. If you play, I don't know, the Petrov, then you have to be aware of white's move knight takes e5. And also 3d4 is a key move, knight c3, trying to transpose to the 4 knights. What I'm saying is this, there's no shortcut. There's no way to just get a good position with black with no effort. But if you hate dealing with the fried liver, or maybe other e4, e5 main lines, maybe you hate dealing with the Spanish, you hate facing the Scotch, the King's Gambit, the Danish, whatever it might be, you can consider other openings. Okay, but let's say that you do want to play e4, e5. After knight f3, you do play knight c6, and white plays bishop c4, maybe angling for a fried liver attack. At this point, you don't know yet. All you know is that we're in the Italian game. Well, in this position, there is one more way that you can avoid having to deal with anything to do with the fried liver attack, and that is to play, rather than knight f6, the move bishop to c5. This is, I would say, the only other very serious move in the position against the Italian, bishop c5, and it's called the Giuoco Piano. Now, after the move bishop c5, we know that knight g5, the fried liver attempt, is just not working. Black can play, of course, queen takes g5. And just in case you're wondering about the move d4, which creates this discovery and attacks our bishop, well, there is queen takes g2. Attacking this rook, black is completely winning. But let's say that white is a little bit cleverer than that. White decides, I'm going to wait for black to play knight f6 and only then play knight g5. So here white goes with knight g5. What will black do about that? Black can simply castle. And now if white decides to start taking things on f7, black ends up with 3 developed pieces to white's 0. And I would also say that most strong players would argue that the 2 minor pieces are way better than a rook, especially in the opening and the middle game. So this position may already be winning for black, believe it or not. Therefore, white probably shouldn't take on f7, but then what was the purpose of knight g5 to begin with? I don't know. As a result, there is no way to achieve the fried liver attack against the Giuoco Piano. Just won't happen. So knowing that this avoids the fried liver, you might think that bishop c5, the Giuoco Piano, is just a better move than knight f6 because you don't have to deal with knight g5. I'm not sure that's true though, because even though, of course, you don't have to worry about the fried liver, there are other ways that white can try to attack you in this position. For instance, white can play with b4, the Evans Gambit, which is something you'll have to be prepared for. And there are also Greco lines from like 400 years ago that are still relevant today, where white plays with c3 and d4 very quickly, taking advantage of this bishop. Now, black is quite fine in all of those cases. I don't think that white has any advantage in any of those lines, but you would have to learn those if you want to play bishop c5. As an aside, I do think that an interesting video topic to follow up after this one would be discussing the differences between the two knights defense with knight f6 and the Giuoco Piano with bishop c5, because they do have certain positives and negatives. Both are played regularly by grandmasters, so it's more of a practical question than anything else. But I do have an opinion about it, and so if you guys are interested, that could be a future topic. Let me know. So that's it for my discussion of the ways that black can completely avoid anything to do with the fried liver, anything to do with the two knights defense. Now it's time for us to jump into the two knights defense. And in this second part of the video, I'm going to give you two different, very fun ways to play this position with black against the move knight to g5. But the first thing I want to mention is that in this position, black has to sacrifice a pawn. And many players out there are very hesitant to do that. I know that when I was maybe a 1500 type player or below that, I really hated any opening where I had to sacrifice material, even if it was good for me, because I was always afraid that somehow my compensation would dry up and then the opponent would slowly but surely get a winning position. The reality is, as I've gotten stronger as a player, I have come to realize that playing for, let's say, a little bit of a material sacrifice, but you get a lot of compensation in return, is one of the best ways to try to win a chess game. It creates some natural imbalances, and it gives you the piece activity that is often more important than 1 point of material in the opening or the middle game. That's what I've found in my own practice, and I really believe that playing the two knights defense with black is a great way to practice playing down material for compensation. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways for black to meet this knight g5 move, and you will have to sacrifice a pawn, but you're going to get very reasonable compensation for it. And they all start with the move d5. That's going to be our main line, regardless of which system we choose within this variation. Now, going back a moment, there are some players who have tried to make the move bishop to c5 work here. That is known as the Traxler counterattack, and I wouldn't really recommend it. It is still an opening that you're going to have to spend a bit of time on to learn all the lines, so it's still pretty complicated, but it also doesn't seem to be as good as the other lines that I'm going to discuss today. So I would say it's not really worth it. It's a very dubious opening in many regards, and you still have to put in a lot of work. So let's go with d5, but as we noted previously, if white takes the pawn on d5, taking back with the knight allows both the fried liver attack and the lolly, so we're not going to recapture on d5. This is where we're going to sacrifice a pawn. And how are we going to do that? There are a couple different ways for black to do it. In the study, I actually go into a bit more detail on this, but I'm going to focus on two different moves today. We will start with the move b5, the Ulvestadt Variation, a very fun, sharp way to play, which is actually quite playable according to the latest theory. If white plays the most obvious looking move, bishop takes b5, then I think you can already see that black has very strong compensation with queen takes d5. This queen is attacking the g-pawn, attacking the bishop, and usually after this, white will play bishop takes c6 just to save things with tempo. And after white castles, black can drum up a big attack already with the move bishop to b7. Let me just give you a sample line. This is not going to be best play at all, but it shows some of the attacking potential in the Ulvestadt. Let's say white plays queen f3 to avoid getting checkmated. Now, we already know from before that if we're the attacking side, we probably don't want to trade queens. That kind of makes the opponent's job easier. So we're going to go with e4 to avoid the queen trade. Let's say queen b3. Black simply castles queenside. We don't care about this fork, knight takes f7. Let's say e3, threatening mate. White goes f3 to stop it, e2, threatening this rook. White goes rook e1 to stop it. Bishop c5 check, king h1, knight g4. Not the only winning move, by the way, but white can't take it because of queen g2, and knight f2 is coming in. There are some variations beyond this, but this is enough for black to be completely winning. So in the Ulvestadt, you often get tons of activity, and it can be very fun to play. Let's say instead that white doesn't go with bishop takes b5. White can also try, for instance, bishop b3, but black is already better here after knight d4. If you ever need to, maybe you can capture this bishop and then take back on d5, but I wouldn't rush to do that. You could also just play h6 to get rid of this knight, bishop b7 to develop your pieces. Black is doing very well. Another try that doesn't work very well for white is pawn takes c6, and then we take the bishop, of course. And now black has this kind of weird broken structure on the queen side, but there are a lot of open lines for these two bishops, and white's pawn on c6 is likely to fall at some point. If white plays queen e2 to attack the pawns on e5 and c4, black can play queen d5 to defend them, and also to try to take back on c6. And h6 is also coming to kick this knight away. So black is already doing well, at least equal in this position. It turns out that there's only one critical way for white to play against the Ulvestadt, only one move that gives white any hint of an advantage, and it's the type of move that your opponent will either know or they don't. So if they don't know it, they're not going to come up with it. And the move is bishop f1. Now, I will admit that it is a lot more likely these days that your opponent will play bishop f1 compared to maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, just because with computers, databases, YouTube videos, there are a lot more ways that the opponent could have learned about this move than in the sort of pre-internet or early internet era. However, according to modern theory, black is okay in this position. Now, the purpose of bishop f1 is that if black plays queen takes d5, notice how, unlike in a previous line that we saw, the bishop is defending this pawn on g2. Black is not threatening to take there. So white can just play knight c3, attacking this queen, and when it moves, then white's bishop can come all the way back to take on b5, and this would be a better position for white. So let's avoid this. The main move these days is for black to play knight takes d5. This uncorks an attack against this knight on g5, and then after bishop takes b5, threatening a big fork on c6, black plays bishop to b7. Now the knight on g5 really is hanging, so white plays d4 to defend it. Black takes, white castles, and this position actually happened in a rapid game in 2024. Magnus Carlsen had black against Gukesh, and Magnus played bishop e7 in this position. Gukesh played the move knight f3, and Magnus actually had an advantage at many points later in the game, although it ended in a draw. Probably the best move for white instead is to go with queen h5, and I discussed this position a little bit in the study, but I don't believe that white has anything significant here. Black will play g6, and there's a little bit of theory, and it gets a little sharp, but it seems that black is holding. Black is doing reasonably well here, and it's a very crazy, weird, chaotic type of position that I think many of you might enjoy if you want to kind of confuse or create havoc against the fried liver aficionado. Now, I did mention at the start of this section that I was going to give you two sort of sideline attempts for black, and the first one was the Ulvestadt with b5 here, but the second one is going to start with knight a5, which is actually the main move for black. And after bishop b5 check, black has two good ways to get out of this check. We will discuss the main move c6 in a little bit, but for now, I just want to talk about the move bishop d7, which I find to be a bit of an underrated choice for black. And there are a lot of ways for white to go wrong against this, and just like the Ulvestadt, there's really only one critical line, which I don't even think is that much of a problem for black. If white plays bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, and you might notice that there is no good way for white to defend this pawn on d5. Even if white plays knight c3, black can play knight takes. And black is ready to castle queenside, and black I think is just better. Typically, if you get your pawn back in this type of opening, you have an advantage because you have good control of the center and pretty active pieces. So this line fails for white. Let's go back. Instead, the only serious line for white, nothing else is even remotely better for white at all. The only serious try is queen e2. This defends the bishop on b5 and also attacks the pawn on e5. And black has tried a couple different moves here. Bishop e7 has been the main line for a long time. In the study, I focus on bishop d6, which I think is a very reasonable way for black to create compensation. And the point is to go c6 next to get this knight back into the game. So for example, one of the main lines continues bishop takes, queen takes, let's say knight c3, c6, and this knight comes back into the game via c6. And this makes a lot of sense because white's queen is on e2, and we can exploit that by going with knight to d4. So for instance, let's say that white decides to castle here. Black can castle d3, knight d4, attacking the queen, looking at the c2 pawn. White needs to play queen d1 here, and then just rook a to c8. So the computer gives this as being very slightly better for white, but I think that black's compensation is pretty obvious, and this type of position is very logical, very easy to play for black. This knight on c3 is somewhat pinned against the pawn on c2, and black may try to displace it by playing b5, b4. Another thing that black might try to do is even to lift this rook, like rook c6, get this rook over here on the c file, or maybe even someday, once you move this bishop on d6, lift the rook over to the king side to create attacking chances. Basically, I would say that this is a great sort of starter way to play against the fried liver attempt by white, and black tends to get pretty strong compensation for a pawn. So if you're looking for something that's not too difficult to learn, where your compensation is pretty clear and you get active pieces, so you got 5 pieces developed against white's 2 pieces here, I think you could do a lot worse than this, but it's not the main line. So now it's time to talk about what the grandmasters do. And the grandmasters in this position typically play knight a5, although as mentioned, a few of them play b5. And after bishop b5 check, they most often play the move c6. White usually responds by taking on c6, black takes back with the pawn, and now there are 3 different ways for white to play from here, and unfortunately, they don't really have much in common, so you will have to study them separately, which is kind of a big barrier to entry compared to the previous lines I just showed, where really white had only 1 critical line in each. However, the positions will always be rich enough for black to have chances to play for a win, and black will have full compensation for a pawn. So this position is known objectively to be pretty good for black, at least equal in every line. So after b takes c6, white's 3 moves are bishop e2, that's kind of the old main line, bishop d3, that's a little bit of a more modern innovation, and then queen f3, which I find to be the most popular move at the club level these days. Don't really know why, maybe some course recommended it, but you will probably face all 3 of these moves at some point if you play this line. So let's talk about each one by one. Let's start with bishop e2, which is kind of the old variation. You're not going to see it as much these days. h6 by black to kick away this annoying knight. Now be aware that there is knight h3 in this position. Not a whole lot of your opponents will probably go for that. Aronian has played it sometimes. He's about the only one who really plays it often. I wouldn't say that it's a very critical variation though. After this, black has lots of choices. Even g5 is a move. Bishop d6 and bishop c5 are both strong. You can wait to take this knight. It's not like it's going anywhere. So I wouldn't worry too much about this line, but it does exist. Going back, knight f3 is the main move, and then after e4, knight e5, black has 2 different choices. You can play bishop to d6, which was the main line for a very long time, or you can play bishop to c5, which is my personal favorite. I analyzed this in the study, and I do think that black is just fully equal here. In fact, in one of the main lines, white ends up giving the pawn back by playing d4 and letting black take it, just because black's play is too strong otherwise. There are issues on f2, there are sometimes issues even on h2 if you ever kick this knight away. And it's just a difficult position to play for white, in my opinion. So people have kind of given up this line, as far as I can tell, in recent years. It doesn't seem to be as popular as it once was. So instead, let's turn towards the move bishop d3, which might be the best move in the position. It makes a lot of sense because now h6 would be met by knight e4. That's the point of bishop d3. So white doesn't have to go back to f3 or h3. They can go to e4 and they can have kind of a comfortable position. We're not going to play h6. We're going to kick this knight in a better way. And the way to do that is to play knight d5, which unveils an attack on this knight, but also introduces another idea to take advantage of this weirdly placed bishop on d3, and that is knight f4. So usually if white saves this knight, let's say they go knight f3, black will try to play knight f4 first, defend the pawn on e5, let's say bishop d6, and then after castles, you can already play the move knight f4. If you can take this bishop here, that's perfectly fine. That would ruin white's pawn structure and give you the 2 bishops, so obvious compensation for a pawn. But also you can wait and you can castle first and then later go with knight f4, and this type of position has turned out pretty well for black in practice. Now going back to the position where white played knight f3, there is also the move h4 that you'd have to be aware of, but black has many moves here. There is h6, there's also queen c7, knight f4 has been played a few times, bishop e7 is sort of a sharp line. So look around, see what works best for you, take a look at some of the high-level games. Now, for some reason these days, the line that I see most often in my students' games is queen f3. And I guess the point of this move is that it looks like it's pinning the pawn on c6 to the rook on a8. And in fact, it actually doesn't really pin that pawn. Black can in fact play pawn takes b5. And I'm going to show this line once, even though I don't really recommend it because it's a little chaotic. But if queen takes a8, black has this very clever move, queen c7. And you could do this if you want to see if you can catch somebody out here. If white just plays one wrong move, like let's say they castle, they're not paying attention, knight c6, and this queen is trapped. It will probably not be able to escape ever. Black can castle, and then eventually bishop to b7 will trap the queen. So in order to avoid that, white needs to play queen f3 here. And then after knight c6, black wants to play knight d4, so c3 to stop that. And then bishop g4. So this type of position has been played quite a few times in correspondence games and some high-level games, and it's very crazy, very sharp. Would I recommend for you to go for it? I'm not sure because you're going to have to learn a lot of really weird, obscure theory, and it is memorization based. I will say, though, that there are probably some opponents who will miss one of your threats even on the way to getting to this position, and so you could have good results just because of that. Now, instead of playing pawn takes b5, black has some sort of saner alternatives. There is rook to b8. That's a pretty reasonable line. Bishop e7 is the main line. And you might notice that this allows white to win another pawn by taking on c6. So if you were already hesitant to sacrifice the one pawn, I'm sure that you really don't feel good about this. But after bishop d7, queen f3, and castle short, it is well known that black has full compensation for two pawns. In fact, black might even be better here. And just to show you one sample line, let's say the white goes d3, black can play knight g4, which attacks this knight, and also frees up the f-pawn to go to f5. So supposing white plays knight h3, because that's the best spot for it, rook c8 attacking down the c-file, white does something about that, knight c3, and maybe black can play f5 here, but there's also this idea, rook to c6, and the rook might lift itself over to the king side. We already saw that previously. Maybe the bishop will later come to c6 to bug this queen on f3. Black, of course, can play f5 at some point. And even though white is up by two pawns, it is very difficult for white to use those two pawns, whereas black gets the initiative. And so these positions are often a lot of fun for black. And I think that this would be a great way for somebody out there to get used to playing positions where you're down a little bit of material, but you get lots of compensation. So the solution to the fried liver, in a way, is to avoid it, because after e4, e5, and we get to the Italian, well, after the move knight g5, d5 takes, you don't take back on d5. That's sort of the main thing to remember. But there are a lot of ways to avoid the fried liver, and I'm sure one of them is going to be good for you. Of course, you can play the Ulvestadt with b5 here. You can play knight a5 two different ways. And of course, you could also avoid it earlier by playing the Giuoco Piano or playing another opening. So I don't believe that anybody out there should ever lose to the fried liver again, because you just shouldn't allow it to happen. And I've hopefully given you a good arsenal of weapons at your disposal so that you don't have to worry about this opening. If this video was helpful for you, maybe my previous video about the Jobava London and how to face it with black, that's another tricky opening that seems to be pretty trendy these days, could be helpful for you too. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or any other things that you'd like for me to discuss, future video topics, and I will see you next time. Have a good one, everybody.